I wanted to do this additional class on Sugya number 4, which we didn't even come close to finishing because uh, it's a very long Sugya. But I just wanted to tie up a few loose ends from the previous class, and just to clarify things a little. So, Sugya number 4, I didn't map out the structure yet. But the first part, it brings the statement of Rabbi Chia, number 1. It compares it to the Mishnah, number 2. And it shows how the statement of Rabbi Chia is opposed to a particular theory proposed by Rabbah. Right? The statement of Rabbi Chia deals with a situation where there's Reuven makes a claim against Shimon in the amount of $100. 2 witnesses come and they support part of Reuven's claim against Shimon. They say, well, we don't know about the full $100, but we do know that Shimon owes him 50. So of course, al pi shenam yadim yakum davar, Shimon has to pay Reuven $50. That everybody agrees with, there's no question. But the Bechia makes an interesting point. Had Reuven made the demand against Shimon in the amount of $100, and had he not brought witnesses with him, but Shimon on his own would have admitted, I do owe $50, but I don't owe $100. In that case, of course, Shimon would pay Reuven the $50, but then he would have to make a shivu'ah. The shivu'ah being, I don't owe him any more money. Like it's just the $50. I don't owe him that other $50 I don't owe him, right? That would be the shivu'ah. I don't owe him $50. What about getting back to the case, and this is the case that the Bichias brings, the case of 2 witnesses. When the 2 witnesses come and they support Reuven's claim against Shimon to the extent of $50, of course, as noted, Shimon would have to pay the $50. Does Shimon also have to make a shivu'ah? If Shimon would have admitted the partial debt himself, he would have to make a shivu'ah on the remaining portion. Does the testimony of 2 witnesses confirming a partial debt against Shimon force Shimon to make a shivu'ah? That's the point of Bichya, and Bichya says yes. And here's the thing: at the end of his statement, the Bichya says, "And you know how I know this? It's a fortiori reasoning." Here's the thing: he never says what the a fortiori reasoning is, so we don't know. Okay. We do know that what the Bichya said somehow confirms our Mishnah, or can be aligned with our Mishnah, and that I explained in the previous class how it could be aligned with our Mishnah. We also know that Rabbah proposes a theory that would apparently stand in opposition to the statement of the Bichya, because Rabbah said that the reason that if Shimon admits part of the debt that Reuven claims, again, Reuven claims 100, Shimon says, no, I only owe 50. The reason we force Shimon to make a shivu'ah, the Torah forces him to make a shivu'ah, is for the psychology that says we're worried about the following situation. It could be Shimon really owes the entire amount, and he just doesn't have the money to pay. Now, he's not going to deny the debt completely. He's not going to say, I owe you nothing. That would be psychopathic. And, the laws of the Torah are not there to deal with the extremities. They're there to deal with average situations. So he's not going to be kofer bakol. He's not going to deny the entire debt. So he can't pay the entire debt. So what he's going to do is he's going to kind of wiggle out of it. He's going to say, look, I only owe you 50 or I only owe you 40. I'll pay you that now. And then later on, when he gets the money in his mind, he's saying, I'm going to pay him the rest of the debt. That's why the Torah says, no, make a shivu'ah about the rest of the debt. We want to make sure this isn't one of those situations where somebody's trying to wiggle out of a debt, right? That's what Abbas said. So according to that reasoning, it's clear why, if Shimon admits part of the debt, it's clear why we would compel Shimon, why the Torah compels Shimon to make a shivu'ah. From that, we cannot draw a parallel conclusion, that if 2 witnesses come to support the Reuven's claim against Shimon that Shimon should be compelled to make a Shavua because that psychological reasoning doesn't apply, right? So, but Rabbi Chia says no. I do think that he should make a Shavua in the case of the two witnesses. And why? So, part two of the Sugya, so part one of the Sugya presents those different, those different, or the tension between the Bichya on the one hand and the Rabbah on the other, right? The tension being whether, in the case of two witnesses, we would compel the defendant to make a shavua. So part two, it analyzes the following question. What's the kal vachomer? And it makes a proposal. And this is what we studied in the previous class. The proposal was that the kal vachomer is as follows. The kal vachomer is this is on Daf Gimel Amud Bet, 1/3 of the way up. And there was like a little variation in the kal vachomer, but the sort of conclusion, the proper kal vachomer is as follows. Edim shemechayevin oto kenas eno din shemechayevin oto shivua. So the kal vachomer was, if his own admission is rather weak. It's weak because if Shimon makes an admission, the defendant makes an admission that he owes the money, that admission would not have the strength to compel him to pay a penalty in cases where penalties are imposed. And yet, even though that admission is noted as weak, he would have to make a shavua, right? Again, he admits part of the debt. He has to make a shavua with respect to the remaining portion of the debt, right? So, now, edim, if witnesses come, that's serious, that's heavy. And the proof that the witnesses' testimony is heavy and heavier than the admission is that testimony will result in a penalty on the defendant. In cases where there's penalty, for example, if the defendant was accused of robbing, he says, no, I didn't rob. Witnesses come and say, yes, we saw you robbing. He would pay double. That's a penalty. He wouldn't just pay what he robbed. He would pay the penalty, right? So there's several cases in Jewish law where there's a penalty. But for there to be a penalty, it has to be serious. You have to have edim who come. And the edim confirm that in this case it was a robbery, right? So how much more so that there should be a shavua, that if the edim come and they confirm a partial debt, that the defendant should make a shavua with respect to the remaining portion of the debt. That was a kal vachomer that was proposed. And just to be clear, there's a total of 5 questions asked against this kal vachomer, and finally it's rejected by the Gemara. The Gemara ends up rejecting this kal vachomer. So I just want to go through the 5 questions. That's really the purpose of this class, so that in the next class we can go on to the next proposed kal vachomer. So this part 2 of the Gemara, let's call it part 2, it proposes the kal vachomer. 5 questions are asked against the kal vachomer, and then finally the kal vachomer is rejected. It's not a proper kal vachomer. It doesn't make sense, so we reject it. So we're left asking, well, then what was the kal vachomer that Bichia was referring to? That would be part C of this. We would propose several more potential candidates for what kal vachomer Bichia was alluding to. But let's just read this part B again. Umay kal vachomer. Now I'm going to go backwards a little. The initial kal vachomer that was proposed was as follows. So the original kal vachomer was as follows, before it's refined, right? If his own admission would not be enough to compel him to pay money, right? And yet it would be enough to compel him to make an oath, again, in the case of a partial admission. Edim, if the testimony of witnesses is enough to compel him to pay money, how much more so that it would be enough to compel him to make a shavua? That was the original Kal V'chomer. On that Kal V'chomer, we ask questions. This is question number one. What do you mean when you say that his testimony can't compel him to pay money? Of course, his testimony, his admission. Reuven says, you owe me $100. Shimon says, you know what? I actually owe you 50. Obviously, his admission that he owes him 50 would compel him to at least pay the 50, right? So what do you mean when you say that his admission is not strong enough to force him to pay money? Of course it is strong enough to force him to pay money, right? His admission is not enough to force him to pay money. Ask the Gemara. If a person makes an admission, that admission has a force of 100 witnesses. I mean, 100 witnesses say he doesn't owe the money. He says, you know what? I owe the money. He owes the money. Yeah. So that was question number one. My mamon kenas, and that's when the Kal V'chomer is refined. And I say what we meant to say is his admission is not enough to compel him to pay a kenas, a penalty, right? But the testimony of the witnesses is strong, and it can compel him to pay a penalty, right? In those cases where there's a penalty. So if the weak admission of a person doesn't compel him to pay a penalty because it's weak, but it still compels him to make a shavuah, how much more so than in the case of the testimony, which is heavy, which is serious, right? And he can be compelled to pay a penalty, how much more so that he would be compelled to make a shavuah, right? That was the refined Kal V'chomer, which I mentioned 10 minutes ago, right? So again, reading it. My mamon kenas, what we meant to say is kenas, we meant the penalty. Kenas, if his admission doesn't compel him to pay a penalty, nevertheless, it does compel him to make an oath. In the case of a testimony of witnesses that does compel him to pay a penalty, how much more so that should compel him to make a shavuah. So the Gemara now asks question number 2 against the Kal V'chomer. Actually, you're saying that his admission is lighter than the testimony of 2 witnesses. It's not so clear that it's lighter than the testimony of 2 witnesses, because his admission would be enough to force him to bring a korban. If a person does an avera b'shogeg and he admits, I did this avera b'shogeg, that would be enough to compel him to bring a korban. A korban chatat, in a case where this korban chatat is appropriate, right? Punish a avera de oraita which has karet, right? So in the case of his admission is enough to compel him to bring a korban chatat. The testimony of 2 witnesses, we saw you lighting a cigarette on Shabbat, and apparently you were confused. You thought it wasn't Shabbat. That testimony wouldn't be enough to compel him to bring a korban chatat. So you see how actually his admission apparently is stronger than the testimony of 2 witnesses, at least in some ways. So the Kal V'chomer is a failure. In order to have a Kal V'chomer, you have to have a clearly stronger case versus a clearly weaker case. Here it's not clear what's stronger and what's weaker. Is it the testimony of the 2 witnesses that's stronger, or is it his admission that's stronger? In some ways, we see that his admission is stronger because it's mechayev al korban, right? Halakashya. So this second question is actually not a valid question. Who said, I have a Kal V'chomer. He just didn't tell us what the Kal V'chomer is. But anyway, the Rabbi Chia agrees with the Rabbi Meir on the question of the Korban, namely, according to the Rabbi Meir, the same way a person's admission would be enough for him to have to be liable to bring a korban chatat, his admission that I did an avera b'shogeg, the testimony of two witnesses that he did an avera b'shogeg would also compel him to bring a korban chatat. So for Rabbi, and that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir, so Rabbi Chia, who agrees with Rabbi Meir, would therefore be able to make a kal vachomer, where the admission of the defendant is weaker than the testimony of two witnesses. And the question of, well, what about the korban? Well, in both cases, there's a korban, so that's not a factor in comparing which is heavier and which is lighter, right? And here's a Mishnah. Here's a machloket. The Gemara is going to bring the Mishnah, which describes the machloket between the Meir and Chachamim. Ditna. Amnu lo shenai machal ta'chalev. According to Chachamim, the majority opinion, two witnesses say, you ate chalev, right? You ate chalev is hayav karet. If a person eats chalev, it's a part of the fat of the animal that's forbidden to eat. The Omer lo achalti. He says, no, it's not incorrect. I did not eat chalev. The Meir mechayev, the Chachamim potri. The Meir says I have to bring korban chatat. Again, the testimony is that it was b'shogeg, right? So the Meir says the testimony of the two witnesses is enough to compel to bring korban chatat. The Chachamim potri. The Chachamim say no, it's patur korban chatat. Witnesses cannot compel you to bring korban chatat. And that Mishnah continues. The Meir is arguing with Chachamim, and he actually brings his own kavachomer. Amar Rabbi Meir, im hevi'uhu shenayim lidei mita hamura, lo yevi'uhu lidei korban hakal. Rabbi Meir says, look, if two witnesses testify that this person, for example, is hayav mita, we gave him hatra'ah, we told him it's Shabbat today, he says, yes, I know. We told him, lighting a fire on Shabbat is haram. Yes, I know, and I'm still going to light this fire and smoke the cigarette. The testimony of the witnesses would make him liable for death penalty. So the Meir says, if the two witnesses can compel him, or rather can make him liable to death penalty, but they're not going to be able to come liable to bring a korban. The witnesses come to the court and they say, we saw him, he was confused as to what day it was. We asked him what day it was, and he said it's Sunday, and then we saw him lighting a fire, and now we're here to testify that he's hayav to bring korban chatat. Obviously, according to the Meir, based on this fortiori reasoning, he would have to bring a korban chatat based on the testimony of the witnesses. But the Chachamim, the majority opinion, disagree. Amru lo, ma'im yirseloman bezid hayiti yipater. Chachamim says it's not so simple, because the guy could be able to say, actually, I did it on purpose. I knew it was Shabbat. You thought I was confused, but I actually knew it was Shabbat. And he would be able to make that testimony, and he wanted to, and then absolve himself from the Hayuv Korban Chatat. So we say the same way we would have believed him had he said, I did it on purpose. I purposely lit a fire on Shabbat. We would believe him on that. Therefore, we believe him when he says that I didn't light a fire on Shabbat. But more properly, in this Mishnah, he says, I didn't eat the haleb. We believe him, right, that he didn't eat it, because he could have also said, I did eat the haleb. I agree with them, but they're mistaken. They think I did it they think I did it b'shogeg. I did it b'mezid. So the same way we would have believed him if he would have said, I ate the haleb b'mezid, we believe him when he says, I didn't eat the haleb at all, right? Anyway, the point being that the kal vachomer that we proposed as Rabbi Chia's kal vachomer, the mystery kal vachomer, we don't know which it is, it stands, it's fine. Again, just to summarize, we had the kal vachomer is the same way his admission, which is light, would be enough to compel him to make a shavuah. The testimony of two witnesses, which is heavy, how much more so should compel him to make a shavuah. So far we had two questions against that kal vachomer. Right. Ella ma lefiv sheken mechayevo asham. So they say a third question against the Kal Vachomer. Actually, the Kal Vachomer is not so simple. They're telling me that his admission is light and the testimony of the witnesses is heavy. But the truth is, I can bring you a case where his admission is heavy and the testimony of the witnesses is light, right? Namely, in a case where a person robbed, and that doesn't have to be robbed. Let's say Shimon has money that belongs to the Oved. Maybe the Oved gave him $100 loan or something. Or let's say a different situation. Let's say Shimon found an object that belongs to the Oved. He found the Oved's hammer. And he says, I know you have my hammer. You must have found it. And Shimon says, no, I never found it. Brings it to Bet Din. I never found it. Bet Din says, make a shavua. He makes a shavua. That's called shavuat pikadon. And then later on, if he admits that he was lying, he has to bring korban asham gezelot. It's a special korban. That's a korban that he brings in the case that he admits, I'm really sorry, I made a shavua and I was lying. That shavua is only made if he admitted it. If the witnesses come, there's no shavua. So here again, we see a case where apparently, again, the whole premise of our discussion is that the admission of a person is lighter than the testimony of two witnesses. But here again, we see a situation where his admission is apparently more severe than the testimony of two witnesses, because his admission compels him to bring a shavua, makes him liable to bring a shavua, whereas the testimony of two witnesses will not make him liable to bring. I'm sorry. His admission makes him liable to bring a korban asham gezelot. The testimony of two witnesses will not make him liable to bring korban asham gezelot. So this is a third question against the Kal Vachomer that we proposed. Asham, Haino korban. They say no. This is just like the previous argument with the korban hatat. It's the same thing here. Namely, according to the Bimeir, if the witnesses testify that he lied in the Shavuot Pikadon, he would have to bring korban asham gezelot, and the Bechia makes Pesach like the Bimeir. So this is not a question against that Kal Vachomer. Well, let's have now question number 5. Ela ma lefi sheken mechayevo chomesh. So they say, okay, wait, let's ask another question. There is a way in which his admission is actually more severe than the testimony of two witnesses. Going back to the same situation, Shimon found a hammer that belongs to Reuven. Reuven demands a hammer back. Shimon says, no, I don't have it. The Bet Din compels him to make a shavua. And it ends up, two witnesses come now. I'm sorry. If he scratch that, and he admits, I'm sorry, if he admits that he was lying, we said before he has to make korban asham. He has to bring korban asham. In addition, when he pays back the money that he had, the hammer, he has to pay back an additional 20%. It's actually 25%. Okay, it's a penalty. He has to pay back a penalty. Whereas if two witnesses came and they said you were lying, he doesn't admit it, but the witnesses say no, we saw him with that hammer. He wouldn't have to pay back chomesh, right? He wouldn't have to pay back that penalty. So here we see a situation where his admission is actually stricter, heavier than the testimony of the two witnesses. Again, they're saying this is not a question. The Bichya agrees with Rabbi Meir, and according to Rabbi Meir, it makes no difference whether he makes the admission or the witnesses say we saw him with the hammer. In both cases, he has to bring korban asham gezelot. In both cases, he has to pay chomesh. So again, the original Kal Vachomer that we proposed is in place. But now we have question. The same way he has to bring a korban, also he has to pay the penalty, according to the Bimeir, and everything I agree with the Bimeir on that point. But now we have the knockout punch against the Kal Vachomer that we proposed. אלא מה לפיו שכן באינו בהכחשה ובהזמה, תאמר בעדים שישנם בהכחשה ובהזמה. They say, look, if a person makes an admission, that's it. It's over. Game over. He pays what he admitted. You have two witnesses. It's not game over. Let's say you have two witnesses. They say, yeah, we know that Shimon actually owes him $50. Okay, you say game over. It's not game over. If another set of two witnesses come, they can potentially annul the testimony of the first set of witnesses, either with hachasha or with hazama. You can have a second set of witnesses who negate the testimony of the first set of witnesses, or hazama. For example, the first set of witnesses says, we were there, we saw him when Shimon gave him, when Reuven gave Shimon $50. Really, when did that take place? It took place on Tuesday. Where did that take place? It took place in Tel Aviv. Second set of witnesses come. Tuesday, you were with us in Jerusalem the whole day. You could not have possibly seen Reuven giving Shimon $50. So the bottom line is that the testimony of witnesses can be annulled. The admission of a person that he owes $50, that's it. It's game over. So here we see how the admission is actually stronger than the testimony of witnesses in some ways. And therefore, this whole idea of making a kal vachomer, it's not a kal vachomer. Kal vachomer means one thing is definitely stricter, another thing is definitely weaker. But here we see the admission is not always weaker. Sometimes it's stricter than the testimony. So therefore, this is not the kal vachomer of the Biyah. The next section in the Gemara will propose a series of kal vachomers. Okay, so section 3 will be a series of kal vachomers to explain what was Bechia talking about when he said, I have a kal vachomer. He never said what the kal vachomer is. I want to point out there was 5 questions against the first kal vachomer. I like that. Hamesh, chomesh, strength, right? It's just Hamushim Alubnei said Me'eres Mitzrayim. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's no significance to the number 5, but I do like the number 5 as a way of knocking out an argument with 5 questions, and finally the 5th question is a knockout punch against Chomesh, strength, right?